the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty.
Welcome back, everyone, to this episode of ALBC.
We are very excited about this week's guest. Erika Cheung arrived at the Theranos corporate headquarters at just 22 years old as a newly minted graduate of the University of California, Berkeley.
At the time, the chemists and biologists saw Elizabeth Holmes just as so many other people did. A visionary CEO, a genius, and a disruptor who was about to completely rewrite the healthcare paradigm.
But Erika's honeymoon phase at her dream gig working for this so-called visionary lasted all of 7 months.
That's when she quit her job in the Theranos lab and became a whistleblower, exposing one of the biggest cons in American business history.
Erika helped federal regulators see Elizabeth Holmes for who she really was, a liar who'd put patients' lives in jeopardy and a fraud who duped investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars.
These days, Holmes is wearing prison jumpsuits, not her signature black turtlenecks, because she's serving out an 11-year, 3-month sentence for her role in wire fraud at the now-defunct company she founded,
Theranos. And our guest, Erika, is moving on with her life. She just happens to be doing it in the perma-spotlight that comes with being a whistleblower in a giant headline-making case.
The Theranos story not only seems made for movies, it's already been the subject of a scripted Hulu series, The Dropout, and the recent doc, The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley. That's where we first spotted her and thought, we need her on our podcast, stat.
And we've been in touch ever since. Everything about the Theranos story seems a little bit culty to us, so we jumped at the chance to chat with her. After all, sometimes a cult looks like a really great job offer with an up-and-coming visionary who turns out to be a faux humanitarian.
I think we've been there. Lots to cover in this episode. We're talking Theranos, the cult of personality in Silicon Valley, and what happens when good people say, enough is enough. Anytime someone blows the whistle on criminal characters, we want to know more.
So here's our chat with Theranos whistleblower, chemist, and biologist, and overall badass, Erika Cheung. Erika, welcome to A Little Bit Culty.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
We are so excited. We have re-immersed ourselves into the world of Theranos to prep for this interview.
We did a deep dive about a year ago.
Yeah, well, I think whenever the doc came out, and I remember watching it thinking I was taking a break from cult content, and you were one of the first people in the episode to say drinking the Kool-Aid, which everyone on this podcast know what that is a reference to. So, well, first of all, how are you? Welcome to the podcast, and how are you in your journey?
I'm doing quite well. So you figure for me, even though the Theranos case is kind of popularized in the media, probably in the last 5 years, for me, this whole journey has lasted about a decade. So I have to say, at the end of 2023 and beginning into this year of 2024, I feel quite at peace and a bit liberated from the case because there's no litigation. There's no having to wait for a federal trial. There's no fear of any type of lingering retaliation in any way, shape, or form that might take. And so you're seeing a very different version of me than you probably would have seen at very different junctures throughout this process. Whether that was the acute whistleblowing process, whether that was being immersed in the company and working at Theranos, whether that was fleeing the Silicon Valley, going to Hong Kong, rebuilding my life in Asia, and then kind of getting sucked back into that world when the case sort of blew up and all the litigation and the indictments and the media kind of picked up on the case. So it's a very different version of me, feel very liberated, very at peace, and it's a good place to be after this very long 10-year experience.
It's a timeline we relate to.
Yeah. It was a similar timeline for us. And I'm so glad that you can say that. And now that I think about it, when we first started emailing, which was almost over a year ago, you're like, I'd love to, but we got to wait for the trial, which is now all done. So yay for that. But let's go back to the beginning. I'm not sure how much of our podcast you're aware of, but our format is pretty standard in terms of like what drew people in and what the red flags were and how they got out. This is not your standard cult, but definitely a lot of cult-like behavior, culty tactics. But tell us back at the beginning, what did you think you were signing up for and what drew you to Elizabeth Holmes, if you don't mind rewinding the clock a little bit?
Yeah, the early days, the good days, the days where
the good days.
Everything looks like it's going to be rainbows and butterflies. I think the early draw for Holmes, I always try and contextualize for people the kind of the Silicon Valley at that time too. So I started Theranos as my first job out of college. So I was 22 years old, just graduated from UC Berkeley, and was kind of starry-eyed around Holmes and the fact that she was this female entrepreneur, dropped out of Stanford, age 19, to start, at that time, a revolutionary tech company where she was really trying to provide less painful, more affordable, more accessible blood diagnostics to people. Right. I was super bought into her, really bought into the vision, and really bought into the hype of the Silicon Valley. I think it was one of the few kind of gems that was kind of blossoming in the economy at that time, because for the most part, being in university during that time, it was all talk of how the recession hit the entirety of the United States so hard. No one was getting jobs. No one wanted to be, of course, involved in finance or this industry or that industry, but tech seemed to be this new industry that was generating all of these cool companies that everyone wanted to be a part of and was managing to still at least financially perform well amongst all of this devastation that had happened in the sort of financial recession. So in those days, kind of like seeing all of this, right? Seeing her, seeing the tech, seeing the hype of being a part of what felt like a change in the course of time of this kind of like dour financial landscape to this like land of opportunity really got me excited and kind of bought into wanting to work for Theranos, wanting to be a part of tech, and wanting to kind of be on this mission to be a part of, a revolutionary company.
How far in was Theranos at the time? Like, how old was the company at that point?
So the company was fairly young. It was fairly young and fairly old, I suppose you could say. So it had been around for about 10 years. And there wasn't much information about the company. So they had raised a fair amount of capital, so in the hundreds of millions. And they had a stacked board, as many people know. They had Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and all of these political figures kind of in there. But there wasn't a lot of info about what was going on, aside the fact that there was this medical device that she had developed in order to convert blood diagnostics from stick in the vein versus a stick in the finger, right? Like to collect all the blood device. So it was around for about 10 years. The size of it was maybe about 100, 200 people at that time. It wasn't a baby, but it was still fairly new
Mm-hmm.
in terms of being in the public eye and people's interest in kind of, what is this secretive company doing that seems to have this ambitious vision and these big goals.
You don't have to tell the whole story because it's really out there in so many formats, but there's clearly a pattern. And I was looking at my notes from when I watched it the first time, even before we had the podcast, of all the similarities between Nexium and Theranos, and the patterns there. But for you, what were some of the first red flags, the potential issues that you saw before you left?
I think the first thing that was kind of strange was the fact that there was such a lack of information about what was happening internally, and that there was this real emphasis on secrecy of competitors are going to come after us if we share any trade secrets. The fact that there was so much that was hush hush seemed a bit strange. And I had kind of written that off, especially being really young, of, oh, well, they're probably working with the military or they're working with the government. And maybe there's some kind of rhyme or reason for why you're secretive, because that is a place and a domain where you tend to have acceptable secrecy or wanting to keep things kind of quiet. But later did I find out that that was actually a giant red flag, not wanting to have transparency in any facet of the business is typically a giant red flag. Another thing, like later on, and it was hard to really identify while I was working for the company because it was quite cool, was how young people were. So a lot of people were just like me, recent grads out of college, didn't have a lot of experience in the working world at all, full stop, not even in diagnostics or healthcare or this sort of really specialized field, but really just didn't have very much work experience at all. And were being put into situations where we're given responsibility that we shouldn't have probably had ownership over. And I think seeing that there were a lot of us who just didn't really know what was going on or had any background context into the healthcare field, being the primary people at the front lines dealing with this technology and dealing with resulting out patients and sort of all these other shady practices that were kind of going on, was a bit of a red flag of like, why we have so many young people.
Do you think that was intentional? Do you think that was a strategy on her part?
So it was weird. It was like there were two strategies going on. It was like at the investment strategy, it's like, let's get people who are way older where they don't have the insight and scope around what the technology is that they're actually investing in. So they can't ask the right questions.
I did notice
And
that.
then at the other converse side, on the side of actually working for the company, there was a whole bunch of young staff who equally, they were smart enough to be able to ask questions on the day to day of what we're doing, but then didn't have the sort of full perspective of, well, how does this really stack up in comparison to other types of technologies that exist in the world today or other types of healthcare institutions that exist today, because it didn't have that primary background of being able to analyze that. And so I think it was by design. And even I'll give you an example. There's a special position called a clinical lab scientist that essentially approves if a patient sample is acceptable or not. And what they would do is they would stick these CLSs, instead of putting them in the laboratory where all these experimental methodologies were kind of happening, they would stick them in a separate office and have them sit there just being exposed to the numbers, but not actually seeing how any of these numbers were developed until they could be trusted to be able to go into the laboratory where all these experimental methodologies were going on. So that was very clear to me when it was like, why we've hired all these people, we've hired all of these qualified people, but none of them are in the lab side by side with me. And what was the explanation for that? Is because, they need to be trusted first, whether they can actually view the technology that we've been operating on patients this whole time. So that was a pretty clear sign that,
Wow.
this is deliberate. this is deliberate. And again, when you're young, like how I was young, I was, 22 at that point. Instinctually, you're like, something's not quite right here. But your framing of it is also not, oh, they're doing something nefarious or malevolent, or, oh, they're doing this because they're trying to create an environment in which people aren't able to ask the critical questions that could get them in trouble. That's not the line of thought.
Particularly, it seems with the cachet and the buy-in that she was able to establish, and I can relate to this and tell me if this is what was going on, was that she's been vetted by people far more experienced than me. Like, I must be kind of in a safe environment in spite of my instincts, which I can relate to. So how did you, if that's accurate, how did you reconcile that? And what was the process of having those instincts and then that got you to ultimately do what you did? It's a long question.
It's a long question, but I think it's a very normal one, right? You have that gut feeling. You're like, something's not right here. I'm also, I was trained as a researcher and a scientist. So what is the fundamentals of being a good scientist is being skeptical, but not only skeptical of other people, but skeptical of yourself. And I think being in the position of one, very little power, being quite young, and in addition to that, looking, as you said, at all of these powerful people that have these stacked resumes that are coming from some of the best institutions in the world saying, this works. We bought into this. We've invested tens of millions of dollars into this. It's, at least in that position, my first expectation is Erika, you might be doing something wrong here. Like there might be.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like an internal gaslighting.
It is an internal gaslighting. And now I can identify that that's what was going on. Like, oh, Erika, you did an immense amount of gaslighting yourself throughout that experience because it doesn't add up, right? It doesn't add up. But the beauty of also being from the sciences is at the end of the day, if you gather enough evidence, and because we were doing things that, like, at the end of the day, you can't fight the numbers. And so for the type of testing we were doing, if I'm doing a sample test, this is basically just comparing, okay, I know this one sample has, 10 nanograms per mil of vitamin D in it. And I run it through my machine. And if it comes out 500, we've got a problem, right? So it was very straightforward in many cases to recognize like, oh, yeah, 10 doesn't equal 500. And so through the process of being able to accumulate a lot of that information, it made me a bit more confident to mobilize on being able to come forward and speak up.
And before we get to that key moment, which we obviously want to hear about, in your intake form, you said you wouldn't mind riffing on some of the culty practices. And you mentioned like this is the key point in the doc, right? On the inventor Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, you said that you'd been drinking the Kool-Aid, which, just a little note for our audience, was actually Flavor Aid, which is it's a common misnomer, but everyone knows what you're talking about. Drinking the Kool-Aid from Jonestown reference. How did you get to that reference? Like in other words, you've clearly seen the correlations. You're on our Little Bit Culty podcast. What were some of the things you'd want to riff about in terms of the other things you saw that were culty?
So initially, I have to credit actually one of my colleagues for pointing that out to me. And it was really in the way she observed me talking about the company that she's like, hey, don't drink the Kool-Aid too fast. And then that was like a moment of realization. And it was one, the adoration for Elizabeth Holmes of like, wow, look at her. She's so impressive. She started this company. She's brought us all here. We have all these fancy machines and all these people from elite institutions. And how special is it to be a part of this company that isn't just pulling together all of this money and all of these people, but also has this beautiful vision in addition to that, right? And I think she could almost see the gleam in my eye of how bought in I was and how convinced I was around what we were trying to accomplish, that it was a bit of a moment of reckoning for me of like, oh, is this some sort of magical thinking or just euphoria that I have around being a part of this organization that seems to kind of check the boxes for me of what I want out of life, what I want out of my career, what I want to propagate and see happen in society.
Your idealism was leveraged.
My idealism was leveraged. It was leveraged.
Transcendental.
Exactly. So I really credit this colleague for that she was the one who made that comment and saw that in me and it gave me that moment of reflection of like, oh, do I have some sort of bizarre glaze in my eye around being a part of the company? And it was a good wake-up call in certain ways, because then it made me a little more astute when you're doing certain actions and you're looking at your experiments that are failing every day. And you're being asked, despite all these failures, to up the ante in terms of how many patients you run, or how many different people you influence, or how far you move the needle in terms of, what you think is acceptable in terms of things. This is very nerdy, but like data integrity, right? Making sure that, are we not manipulating information in a way to make it look pretty versus having it give an accurate depiction about what's happening, right? And there were just these tiny little ways in which we were constantly pushing the needle of what the integrity looked like. And I'm sure you guys have seen this too, that it doesn't start off super strong. They're not like, hey, give me, I want you to just basically give me a number that sounds good, right? They don't kind of come out the door saying that, but it's just these subtle ways that they sort of get you to slightly modify what you think is acceptable over time.
Right.
It's like the compass gets turned in a way. Yeah, that probably made me realize, okay, there's some other cultural dynamics going on here in addition to more puppet mastering that's occurring than maybe I'm conscious of.
This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Break time's over, people. Let's get back to this episode of A Little Bit Culty. It's a good one.
A common question we get is, do you think Keith Raniere had a good idea here? It went bad, whatever. I think Keith was bad from the start, and he set this organization up for himself for whatever.
And there's lots of proof of that.
Whatever holes he wanted to fill.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think Elizabeth set Theranos up for her own holes to fill? Like,
Well, you're skipping to the end.
Well, I mean, I guess, was there ever a product?
Yeah.
In your opinion? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, did you ever feel like if she had started to succeed, does it justify everything? Right? Like, does that make sense? Was there ever a glimmer of like this happening?
Gosh. So this is a huge loaded thing.
Part of the trial,
to unpack.
right?
Yeah.
In so many different ways. Yeah. And of course, in the trial, there's of course my opinion. And then there's like, what did the litigation say?
Right.
When it came to, was this a fraud or was this not a fraud? And there's a very technical definition of what patient and wire fraud is. Was that the case? And that was proven to be the case, right? That there was definitely wire fraud that occurred and that there was patient fraud that occurred. Of course, the sentencing between Sunny and Elizabeth had some disparities between the two of them. But I think back to your earlier question, in the case of Holmes, do I believe that she was from the start trying to fill some sort of personal void? 100%, right? Was it with the malevolent intention? I think these types of psychologies are and personalities are so hard to deconstruct, because in comparison to just like almost blatant greed and blatant fraudsters are a little bit easier to deal with, right? It's like, oh, it's the money. They're after the money. But when you deal with people who seek things like power or fame or some sort of fulfillment of some lack that is hard to quantify, it gets much more complicated.
Absolutely.
And I think to a certain degree, is it possible that point of care diagnostics could and did exist at that time? Yes, 100%. Can you take a finger stick and run some blood samples on it? Yes. Where Theranos went wrong was you can't necessarily take a drop of blood and run hundreds of tests, nor can you do that in one box. And maybe we'll find some sort of technological advancement that makes that viable, but Theranos and where the company was nowhere near that, right? There was absolutely no scientific innovation that actually happened that moved the needle of the industry in itself that we were working on, right? Like at all. If anything, because of Theranos, it set back people's ability to innovate in that space, because people are so scared to touch diagnostics because they don't want to probably lose face for being involved in another failure around diagnostics, that really, it I think created more of a risk aversion and almost over excessive risk aversion to that space.
That's such a shame.
It's such a shame. There's so many, and I'm sure you guys had this too, even though being at the helm of whistleblowing and stopping the case, like there's still so much heartbreak that comes from that, right? Like that idealism that they played on.
Absolutely.
Those ideals didn't disappear for me, right?
There's moral injury.
It's the moral injury. It's the grief and the loss and the sadness and the betrayal. There's so many emotions that end up coming to the forefront of these cases, and they ripple into so many different things beyond just that case itself.
How far off is she? Is it as crazy as me going to like someone and saying, hey, I want to do a time machine, give me hundreds of millions of dollars? And then how absurd is her idea?
So her idea, parts of it are not, it's like two truths and a lie. So there are some truths there of things that you can do.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of what we were doing at Theranos, how I compare it is that she promised everyone a magic carpet that could fly and delivered people a hoverboard. But worse yet, the hoverboard she shipped, when you plug them in, they explode. And that's pretty much what she did. So
I like
that's
that.
a great metaphor.
That's awesome.
That's kind of what what was accomplished. And so, so it was pretty far off. It was pretty far off. And it's hard, right? It's hard when you see these big machines and when people are working so hard to develop things, that it's hard for people to see like, well, look, we had all of these $1 million machines, or we manufactured all of these different units. It's like, yeah, but they don't work, right? That was one of the things they did in the trial, where it was like, oh, okay, if the company wasn't working on building this, look at these stacks of papers of all these experiments that they had run to like show you that this technology was viable and it existed. And it's like, sure, I can like write on a piece of paper that, I did this experiment, but if they all fail, that doesn't mean I have a product that works, right? Like I can run
such a non sequitur.
I can run millions of experiments.
It doesn't seem to show a track record of progress either.
Yeah.
Just circling back to something you said about like the internal feeling and being overridden by the idealism, I think one of the things we certainly saw watching the doc anyway is also the corporate rah-rah, like for lack of a better word, the songs and the gatherings and the hype. And that aligns with what you were saying, like it's, feeling special and being part of all that and how great that must have felt. Sidebar, calling them Eagle 1 and Eagle 2. I'm pretty sure we called Nancy and Keith that, didn't we? At certain points, like 1 and 2, like it was that kind of like they'd come in together and it was that kind of vibe. If not called that directly, it was certainly that vibe. But yeah, so going from that, all of those red flags, what was the final straw for you? When did you decide that you had to speak up and become I guess there's probably 2 points: speaking up and then being dismissed and then becoming a whistleblower.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah. So I had reported internally several times, right? Of saying like, something's not right here. And it wasn't like overarching, something's not right here. It was like, this experiment, this didn't work. We're having problems with this type of test. We're having problems with this. And so I had done a lot to report internally to different people within the organization. But I think the big turning point for me of the fact that, okay, these aren't just issues that we have in the company, that there's something bigger going on here, is when I had a conversation with the COO of the company. And I had gone into his office and basically told him, I'm concerned about the issues that we're having in terms of the failures of our patient test and the frequency of them, and the fact that when we make a mistake on a patient sample, we don't notify them. And when I had reported these concerns to him, he basically said, you are a recent graduate from UC Berkeley. Have you ever taken a statistics class? Do you know anything about statistics? You need to do the job I pay you to do, which is to process patient samples without question. And so at that point, I was just shocked. I was really jarred. I was like, okay, this isn't the case that there's some discrepancy between what the executive management knows and what's happening at the operational floor. They know exactly what's going on. They're just not doing anything about it. And so I think that really flipped for me what type of situation I had gotten myself into. Before that, I think I was still operating by the principle that you're in a startup, things aren't working, that's why you're hired, you're here to fix the problems. But at that point, I realized, oh, no, there's something else going on here. And I talked to the board as well. I'd gone to the board's house and had a conversation, and he basically said, maybe I should look for another job.
Wow.
And I think after those experiences of internally reporting, kind of going up every level of command, basically, to kind of get the truth out, I was very disempowered. I didn't know what to do. I was very concerned about the fact that they were testing on patients, even though it was pretty well proven that these tests weren't working, even by our own internal standards. And I tell a lot of people I got lucky in the sense that I had gotten contacted by John Carreyrou, who was the main reporter who reported on the case. And for me, it wasn't even a second thought. It was like a breath of fresh air of, oh, okay, there's one opportunity to get the truth out. Like, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take whatever door presents itself to me to allow the truth to get out. And I didn't really think twice. I didn't probably do as much due diligence as I should have in terms of vetting, like, is this a good journalist or not? And honestly, before his report came out, the company was so litigious that they had basically come after me, threatened to sue me, and had private investigators following me when I was living in the Bay. But that was also a bit lucky in a strange way, because it sort of allowed me to understand that I could also report to regulators, that was an opportunity for me, that the regulators were ultimately the governing body that could shut down their ability to process patient samples. And so once I figured out, like, oh, you can do this and you can do it anonymously, it was great. It was kind of crazy, though, because when I had first figured this out, I had tried to go to San Francisco in order to walk into the office to file the report. But I was so paranoid about the fact that I was being stalked and followed, and that they would see me entering into the building, that I ended up pacing like a crazy person around the streets of San Francisco, trying to see, is someone following me? Is someone not? That I like couldn't do it that first day. And so then I ended up getting a burner phone and calling them through the burner phone and then figuring out, oh, okay, this is how you file a report. And it took me a while to file the report. I had a lot of personal issues. I was taking care of someone who was dying at that time. So It took me a while to write out the report. These things never happen at opportune times. It's like a really crazy summer for me. But that's kind of what led me to speaking up, was a mixture of the desire to just say they need to stop testing on patients, and also a bit of luck in terms of kind of bumping into the right people who sort of helped me build my awareness of what were the opportunities for me to allow the truth to get out. Right? Like, you don't walk around 23 years old like, oh, I'm going to knock on the door of the Wall Street Journal and have them hold this company I used to work for accountable.
You don't walk around at 43 years old doing that.
Doing that. That's something that you think that you're ever going to be presented with, especially when you started off like really, it's crazy. I really thought Theranos was going to be the company I was going to work for the next 10 years of my life. Like, I was that bought into what we were trying to do. And then next thing you know, you're having to kind of change course.
One thing Sarah and I learned is you don't get to pick and choose how and why you're going to stand for what you're going to stand for. Why not walk away at that point for you?
In my case, I knew what I stood for when I joined the company. Like, I stood for the fact that I wanted to figure out how to leverage technology to provide affordable and accessible healthcare to people. I knew that, right? Like, I went in very clear-minded, very clear-headed that this is how I wanted to spend my life and my career. And I think because our actions were so counter that, we were lying to patients. We were telling people they may or may not have had cancer when we didn't even trust these tests. Like, people internally in the organization would get their blood test results on the Edison devices and like freak out because they were just having such like false reports on everything. And so I think that made it easy, even though it was scary and hard, to kind of keep pushing through, because I did have a very clear understanding of why I joined the company, what I stood for, how I wanted to spend my time, how I wanted to spend my career. Why did I study the sciences? Why did I do all of these different things? It was very black and white in many ways for me, and made it all the easier. I think what makes it complicated was actually the circumstance of like, are you actually right about this or not? Is this the case that you're actually right about the issues that are going on? And because of my lack of experience, and because of the amount of intimidation and gaslighting and just kind of like Twilight Zone environment of a workplace that was, where like all of a sudden, up is right and 20 is 76 and just all this wild stuff. That's what was the complicated part, I think, for me. It was like the mission, the principle, the what to stand for, very clear, very easy. It was, are you actually right about this? And I think also, I didn't want to be right about this.
Yeah.
It's so gross, right? Like, when you really look at it, you're like, this is so awful that I almost want to be delusional about what's happening, because the reality of what we're actually doing is so painful.
I totally agree.
And so counter what I signed up for, that it's just even your personal resistance to the truth. Like, there are very few times in life that you want to be wrong about something this badly.
Totally. Yeah, we've been there.
Yeah, for sure. For more background on what brought us here, check out Sarah's page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, and at most bookstores. If you want to see that story in streaming form, watch both seasons of The Vow on HBO.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
You've heard from our sponsors. Now let's get back to a little bit culty, shall we?
I totally remember doing interviews at the beginning and even still saying, like, this is bad, right? Like, I totally remember that feeling.
Also, it's the opposite of what you signed up for.
The opposite,
it's
yeah.
the opposite.
I'm glad you guys say that because that was something I struggled with a lot. And I think other people struggled with me a lot, where I don't think they understand what it's like being in that environment. So when you come out of it and you talk about it, for them as a objective seer of the circumstance, they're able to say, no, this is clearly wrong. But because you were immersed and inundated, and there's so many emotions and there's so many relationships and experiences and different things that are involved in that process, it's very challenging to have that objective view, even being outside of the case, even though, it's 10 years later for me, maybe not quite 10 years in terms of the actual act, but 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really listen to any of the interviews that I do, frankly, but I know in terms of seeing a younger version of myself that it was hard for me sometimes to grasp with like, but this is wrong, or having to justify my actions or even ask for just some sort of assuredness. And that's weird. Like I look back at that and I'm like, how did they do that to me?
Your own character is in question to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is part of the strategy.
Bizarre thing, because I felt my character wasn't in question until I saw something. I'm like, oh, whoa, I'm actually aligned with something that was perpetrating.
Yeah.
I had to reconcile that. And that was the gymnastics I had to kind of, and admit you're a victim and you got conned and all that stuff messes with your pride.
What was it like for you to have all of this like in the public space? Because there's been a documentary, there's the Hulu series, and there is, we haven't watched it yet, to be okay, just so you know, we didn't have time to watch it. But I did see that there's a character of you, right?
So I haven't watched it either. so don't feel bad because technically there is a character of me and I haven't watched
Probably
it
best
either.
not to, I feel. I don't know.
Yeah, it was a little too soon for me. It's been, how do I explain this journey? It's complicated. It's very, very complicated. My initial intentions were always to be anonymous because I loved my simple life. I was totally fine being in the background, working on my projects, and just having some level of anonymity. And that was valuable to me. But what ended up happening is I got subpoenaed for a court case. The judge ended up releasing my deposition into the public record. And then my name got out, the media picked up on it, and they were kind of misquoting some of the things that I had said. And so at that point, people said, Erika, if you don't control your story, other people will. Yep. And I was like, what does that mean? Right. And at this point, I'm like 25, 26, and I'm like, oh God, here we go. Mm-hmm. And so that opened the door to a very complicated process of like, well, who do I engage with? How do I engage with them? And also you're traumatized, right? So you're like trying to make these decisions. And I was so young, and it's not like, it's hard to explain to people this type of fame because it's not like, oh, I've worked the past 20 years to become an astronaut. It finally happened and everyone wants to hear about it. Mm-hmm. It's like, I was in this horrible circumstance that was like semi in my control, but largely out of my control. I made it out kind of okay, but I don't feel okay. And now everyone wants to talk to me about it. And it's inspirational on one end and it's sad on the other. And like, how do you negotiate that? And I had largely spent my journey in avoidance of like, that's that one horrible thing that happened to you at work at time. We're never going to talk about it. We're packing our bags. We're moving to Hong Kong. We've completely changed careers. I went from being a scientist to working in venture capital, right? Like I had really distanced myself from the whole experience. I was like, we're not going to deal with that. And then I had to like confront all that on the public stage. And so now, like I said, you're seeing this sort of like healed version of mine, but it was very complicated, very challenging. Has it come with blessings? 100%. Has it come with challenges? 100%. And so even to this day, I haven't really been able to kind of sort it all out, except with acceptance of like, that's what happened. That this is the way it worked out. You just have to sort of accept that. And of course, there's a way in which you can kind of with all of these cases, they die down and they go by the wayside, like with everything in life. But it was quite complicated for me because I was so young. I didn't know how to negotiate it. I am a pretty open and transparent person in general, but you have that level of being exposed. It was just a world I wasn't prepared for, or didn't know how to negotiate, I think, like other people might have.
I wish we'd been friends at the time.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I went through everything you just said. I just wish I could have imparted it so you didn't have to go through it.
Well, what you just said in the beginning was the reason I got involved. If you don't tell your story, someone else will, and they're going to butcher it. And so it was the only reason I did the vow and any of that stuff. I wasn't particularly interested in getting attention, not based on my merit, but based on something that happened to me.
But truly, like Erika, her merit, and I heard somebody say, I got goosebumps when I heard the narrator of the Dropout podcast. I don't know if you listened to that, summarizing the trial, just to say that she had remarkable. Described you like that the whole reason that we're having the trial is because of characters like Erika Cheung, who has remarkable integrity. And going back to like your desire for data integrity, your integrity is the reason this has all come to light. And also to you, Nippy, like you do have merit in, we all fucked up. We all fucked up.
I'm not seeking to minimize that aspect of it, but I'm simply saying when I signed up to do this and when I've gotten attention for something, it's based on something I've set out to do, not something that happened to me, and I don't mean to minimize like, how we handled it and how we turned it into a positive and how we did the right thing in any shape or form. But it was uncomfortable to go through that. And then, to your point, people don't necessarily understand it. And you're reconciling to understand it while you're having conversations about it. It's a weird thing to do.
Yeah. I think it was strange too, because there was litigation that was going on. Like that's rare when that happens, where it's like the reporting happened during the downfall, right? The litigation happened while all of this was public versus it wasn't a closed case that people took all the information and then decided to do something with it. And I think that generated an immense amount of paranoia for me, an immense amount of feelings of lack of safety. And even, to this day, like I haven't signed a lease for the last 8-9 years of my life, right? Like I have like floated about. There are all these weird things that I do now that are probably a consequence of the like just deep lack of safety that I felt I had because of just the amount of exposure that was occurring simultaneously with all of these like other aspects. And so I think that was the uniqueness of this case it was just so, there was so much attention on it while it was still unfolding. So I think that was what made it strange. And I think, serendipity is the same thing, right?
Yeah.
When it happens, I think anyone who goes through these traumatic experiences, you have to have that hard conversation with yourself around like, well, what now? What now? And the best you can do is just take that, process it, accept it, grapple with it, grieve it, whatever process you need to go through. And ideally, if you can say, how do we transform this in something that can be beneficial to others? How can we transform this in something that can have some sort of rebirth out of the circumstance? And Sarah, to your point, one of the big helpful things that helped me during the trial was actually my friendship with Cynthia Cooper, who was the WorldCom whistleblower. And I don't think I would have made it out of that trial without her guidance and mentorship and just sheer kindness and perspective.
That's so great.
Of it's hard, it's difficult, it's not going to stop being difficult until it's over. So just sit in the discomfort. And that's a message I needed to hear. And I needed an ally of someone. Of course, she has her own unique experience. You guys, of course, have had your own unique experience, but there are commonalities, right? And we're dealing with these types of kind of culty organizations or cults themselves, or just groups that kind of create these circumstances for people that they feel they're a part of this thing, but also trying to escape out of in different ways. So that kind of opportunity to share with people and also be an ally to other people who will likely be in these circumstances has been immensely powerful for me. It was powerful for Cynthia as well to help me through that because, yeah, it's unfortunate when you are in these circumstances. They're so sad and hard, but the best you can do is grow out of them.
Absolutely. I have to tell you that, we could do a whole episode on how culty Elizabeth Holmes is and analyze her behavior and all that stuff. But this episode for us is really about the journey of a whistleblower. And there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast who are in cults or debating leaving cults or have left and debating whether to whistleblow. And we haven't really done like a dedicated episode on that. Do you have any advice for future whistleblowers on this episode or anything you would have done differently? Nuggets you can glean there for us?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is build out a support network. That's the biggest thing. Think of who are the allies that you're going to need. And ideally, there are people who, if you have allies within the group that you're a part of, that's great, but also external. A lot of lawyers with whistleblowers work on contingency. And even if you can't hire them, maybe have a starter conversation around what's kind of occurring. There are lots of these agencies and nonprofits and advocacy groups that you can turn to if you have a question. Some people don't have strong family support or friend support, but at the same time, it's that we all have at least, even if it's a barista, even if it's someone, you would be surprised at the kindness of strangers when you tell them, I'm really in a bind. I need to start somewhere to get help. Like really try and formulate that support network because it's going to be really crucial throughout the journey of whatever you decide to do. I work a lot on the whistleblower advocacy side now with people like the Signals Network that deals with media whistleblowers and tech whistleblowers. There's lots of good nonprofits out there, and there are lots of resources out there that people can kind of turn to. But I think personally for me, it's like making sure you have a wide range of people that you can kind of turn to for questions and emotional support and just perspective on what's happening. And it's not always easy to build, and I know it's hard, but that's, I think, really crucial for these types of cases and circumstances.
Couldn't agree more. We have a portion of our episode, we talk about the thing that chaps your ass the most about the whole experience. And this is more the lighter content, like the thing that's eye-rolly. Nippy, for him, it's the voice, putting you on the spot. What's the thing for you?
That gets me bothered.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it.
He calls it chaps my ass.
Gets me bothered portion of our podcast. It's optional.
And it could be about the press. It could be about the trial. It could be about the experience itself. It could be anything.
The thing that I think bothers me about the voice is everyone, and this is when you have a cult of personality, everyone fixated on the voice for so long that it was almost like people ignored all the other egregious things that she had done and were so hyper fixated on the voice. And I was like, why are people just paying attention to this like quality that she has versus the fact of all the actions that she had done? And it was really strange to me to kind of see that it was like, oh yeah, people are more concerned with this sort of like image-based stuff than they are about like what are the actual actions of what's occurring. And that was a big shock for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly one of the first things I noticed. It was just something that was weird. I was like, it was incongruous.
It's like Keith's volleyball.
Yeah. Keith did a lot of things that were like a persona, especially. That was one correlation I made also. Both had this faux humbleness, like this pretend humanitarian thing.
Yeah. I think that would have been another thing that really bothered me was the kind of like the lying around the patient experience in her uncle, like to create more empathy. And it was like, oh, this is when you're dealing with a particular type of dark triad individual, is when you are basically lying about personal stories in order to garner more attention from others. And that was a bit jarring and surprising for me.
Yeah, highly, highly manipulative. Well, we loved having you on this podcast. It's been in the works for so long, and it's really come full circle for us. And such an honor to meet you. I really think what you did was so brave. And, we want only the best for you next.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Nippy.
Thank you, Erika.
You like what you hear? please do give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know what to do.
Hope you liked our chat with Erika.
I think we could have kept her on the line for another hour.
For sure.
First of all, it was midnight for her, so she had to go. But I think
it was nice of her to do that.
It was really nice. We're going to have to try to get her back on for our Patreon subscribers and get into the weeds of the story.
And the thing about the Elizabeth Holmes story is we got to ask, are there more Elizabeth Holmes being nurtured right now at some startup somewhere? Great question.
And what are the effects of people are so many startups do start that way with a vision of something that's has never been done before. And people are going to be like, this is another Theranos.
And also think of the people she had. Why would you think that Henry Kissinger, do you know what I mean? All the credibility that was leveraged, and it should shine a light on people to ask different questions and what we put our trust in, at the very least.
This time we live in is just ripe for brilliance, and it's ripe for bad actors to take advantage of the cult of personality, fame, and the need for being the next Steve Jobs, which is clearly something she was aspiring to do.
And speaking of Steve Jobs, we want you to be the next Steve Jobs of our Patreon. Come find us over there at patreon.com/a-little-bit-culty. Starting at just $5 a month, you get ad-free listening and free bonus episode, and the perks just add up from there. All the way up to we'll send you a care package full of some culty goodies.
Until next time, don't take a job at a place where someone at the top is a mysterious genius who wears the same black turtleneck every day. That's just a big red flag.
Huge.
See you next time.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/a-little-bit-culty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out a-little-bit-culty.com/culty resources, and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain/bodyguard, Jess Temple Tardy. Our show writer is Holly Zadra, and our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.
That's the sound of your current hype level at the gas pump. But brace yourself for something fuel-nominal, because Unleaded 88 is about to take the hype to a whole new level. Unleaded 88 is cheaper, cleaner, and greener than regular unleaded. Plus, it's homegrown, making Unleaded 88 the clear choice at the pump and totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88, brought to you by Iowa Corn.